Hi friends. Tonight, I invite you to drift gently through the sands of time, back to a land gilded in gold and mystery, a place known to ancient tongues as Kush, the heartland of Nubia. Our story begins not with the roar of war or the clashing of spears, but rather with a whisper on the desert wind, a summons to a throne both divine and cursed. This is the tale of what it might be like to walk a day, just one single day, as a Black Pharaoh of Nubia, a sovereign not only of men, but of gods and destiny alike. And as you'll soon see, it is not a day for the faint of heart. So lay your head down, gentle soul. Let your thoughts meander like the Nile itself. And as the moon casts her silver gaze upon the dunes, let me tell you the first chapter. The dream began in silence, not the heavy silence of dread, but that fragile hush that lives between breaths, between centuries. You awoke not in your own bed, but in a chamber carved of sandstone, cool and dim, bathed in a light that flickered like the memory of fire. A strange weight pressed upon your shoulders, not heavy, not painful, but solemn, as if destiny itself had placed its hand there. You were dressed in linen, soft and ancient, though you could not remember dressing yourself. Around your neck, a wide collar of faience and gold rested against your skin, catching the weak light. And on your brow sat a crown, a curious thing, shaped like two coiled cobras, their hoods flaring protectively over your eyes. The twin uraeus, the sign of rule over both upper and lower lands. You were in Napata, the sacred heart of Nubia, the capital of the Kushite Empire. The very air smelled of history and heat, resin, stone, and sun. There came a voice from the shadowed doorway. "My Pharaoh, the hour is near." You turned and saw a man bowing deeply, his age betrayed only by the silver in his braided beard. His eyes, however, were sharp. He introduced himself as Kamudi, high priest of Amun at Gebel Barkal, the mountain of the gods. You were to make your appearance at dawn, before the people and the heavens alike, to accept your coronation. "Am I truly Pharaoh?" you asked, your voice sounding strange in the chamber, too regal to be yours. The priest nodded. "You are Tahaka reborn, a chosen son of Nubia, but beware." And here he looked toward the open sky, where stars still lingered in the last watch of the night. "The gods give power not for comfort, but for burden. A pharaoh must bear the weight of two worlds." The ritual began before sunrise. You were led through the temple precinct, down long corridors painted with scenes of triumph and divinity. Musicians played soft, slow rhythms on harps and flutes, their songs echoing through halls of polished stone. Incense coiled in the air like silent serpents. Myrrh, frankincense, and blue lotus, each scent unlocking something in your memory, something older than you. You passed statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, their faces calm, impassive, their eyes watching. The throne awaited you at the temple's highest terrace, where the Nile shimmered like liquid obsidian beneath the coming dawn. Around you gathered the elite of Nubia, priests and generals, scribes, and artisans, all draped in robes of red ochre and ivory linen. Their heads were bowed, not in fear, but in reverence. Kamudi anointed your brow with sacred oil and intoned words older than empires. "You are chosen by Amun, beloved of Ra, mighty as Horus upon the wind. May the land flourish under your shadow." You sat upon the lion-legged throne, your spine straight, though your soul trembled, and then came the first challenge. The Nile priestess stepped forward, her voice carrying like a reed flute in the hush. "Your Majesty, the god Hapi has spoken. The floodwaters will come late this year. The fields of Upper Kush will suffer drought. Shall we divert the irrigation from the temples?" It was your first test as Pharaoh, and the room awaited your answer. A single decision between the needs of the people and the will of the gods. Diverting water from the temples was sacrilege, but letting your farmers starve would weaken the nation. What would a true pharaoh do? You chose compassion. You spoke clearly. The gods feed on eternity, but men must feed on grain. Let the waters flow to the fields. There was a pause, and then murmurs of approval. But as the priestess bowed and withdrew, you noticed Kamudi's face tighten. Not in anger, but in worry. You had pleased the people, but risked offending the divine. And in ancient Nubia, the gods were never far. You were escorted back into the palace, where an immense hall of pillars stretched before you like a forest of stone. There, the Queen Mother awaited, regal, veiled, and silent. She was the true architect of your reign, though she would never wear the crown. Her voice, when it came, was low and rich, like the river itself. My son, the lion does not sleep beneath a crown of feathers. The vultures will test your reign by midday. And so, you learned your second truth, that being pharaoh meant ruling in shadows as much as in sunlight, and that every hour brought a new judgment. But that is a tale for another night, dear friend. For now, let the incense linger in your thoughts. Let the Nile lull you with its eternal rhythm. You have taken the throne. But dawn is only beginning. The morning sun had scarcely lifted above the cliffs when the silence of your palace was broken. A runner, barefoot and breathless, arrived with news from the southern border. Trouble brewed where Kush met the gold mines of the eastern desert. Nomadic tribes had raided an outpost in the night, and one of your commanders had been slain. The message was simple, hurried, and sealed with a crimson smear. The desert kings move beneath the moon. This, they told you, was your second hour as pharaoh. You were still dressed in ceremonial linen, your coal-lined eyes weary from a sleepless night of rituals. And yet, before you stood a council of voices, each sharper than the last, viziers, generals, priests, offering advice like swords drawn in the dark. Strike now, said General Anok, his voice loud, his jaw scarred from battles past. Show the nomads your fury, and they will scatter. Wait, urged the high scribe, a man named Hekanacht. Dispatch messengers first. A hasty war bleeds coffers more than enemies. But it was Kamudi, the high priest, who said least and stared most, his eyes fixed not on you, but on the amulets on your chest, the ankh, the scarab, the eye of Horus. He knew something none of them did. That divine favor was as brittle as papyrus in dry hands. You looked out over the courtyard below, where palm trees swayed in the morning heat. The air shimmered with the breath of coming noon. Somewhere beyond those hills, your people bled into the sand. You had never been to the mines. You had never seen blood spilled in your name. And yet, the vultures had already begun to circle, so you chose diplomacy. Send emissaries, you said. But let them go with the sound of drums. The desert tribes must know our patience is not weakness. Anok was silent, his eyes tight with unspoken doubts. But he bowed, and the court dispersed, leaving you alone, beneath the great cedar roof, where carved falcons seemed to fly above you in stillness. You were pharaoh, and yet, already, your decisions were judged not by their wisdom, but by their strength. You stepped back into the hall of Heka, where your royal scribes awaited with scrolls stacked like bricks, the daily records, grain tallies, temple offerings, tribute schedules, formed a tidal wave of ink and parchment. Each document bore your name, each demanded your seal. It was here you met her. Tieni, royal archivist and head scribe. A woman of sharp wit and gentle voice, her presence was like cool shade in desert heat. She bowed low, not out of fear, but of custom. Your Majesty, she said, laying the first scroll before you. May I speak plainly? You nodded. This empire is built not on gold nor spears, she said, but on ink, on records, on knowledge. She tapped the scroll. And knowledge is slipping. You listened as she spoke of corruption, Temple accounts that didn't balance, missing records from the elephantine trade, miscounted soldiers paid twice for the same month. Not crimes of rebellion, but erosion. Soft, slow decay beneath the splendor. "You are Pharaoh," she said, "but you must also be a fisherman, casting nets through murky waters. The crocodiles swim quietest where the water is deepest." And with that, she left you to your seals and your silence. As the midday sun blazed, the royal kitchen brought figs and bread and a cool drink made of pomegranate and herbs. You ate alone. You drank deeply, though it did not quench the weight, behind your eyes. This throne, carved of ebony and inlaid with lapis, was beginning to feel more like an altar than a seat. Then came your third visitor. He was introduced as Thutmose, an emissary from Thebes, tall, pale-skinned by Nubian standards, dressed in the feathered linens of Egypt. He spoke the Kushite tongue with elegance, though not without effort. His smile was soft, but his gaze cut deep. "Pharaoh," he said with a bow, "the Nile has two banks, but one soul, and Thebes wishes to know which bank your loyalty favors." "Ah, Egypt, the old mistress, the river's northward daughter, once conqueror of Nubia, now uneasy ally. You had inherited a throne claimed by both lands, a crown born of diplomacy and blood. Already the world watched your every move. Thutmose placed a gift at your feet, a scroll from the Oracle of Karnak, offering blessings and veiled questions. Would you maintain the sacred festivals of Amun in Egypt? Would your armies assist in quelling unrest near Elephantine? Would you remember who first taught you the rights of kingship? You smiled. You answered with warmth, but your heart began to understand. Every choice bore thorns. And as Thutmose withdrew, his sandals whispering over polished stone, you whispered back, not to him, but to yourself. "I am Pharaoh, but who's Pharaoh?" Evening began to fall, and with it, your body longed for rest. Yet a final duty remained. You were taken to the tomb chamber, where the walls told stories in painted reliefs, of your ancestors, the Black Pharaohs of Nubia, towering in divine splendor. Pie, who marched north with dreams of unity. Shabaka, who rewrote the laws of Ma'at. And Taharka, lion of the empire, builder of temples, breaker of chains. You stood before the statue of Taharka himself, larger than life, arms crossed in eternal command, and you asked him softly, "How did you bear it?" The stone, of course, said nothing, but the wind through the columns spoke in its own way. It carried with it the scent of the Nile, the far-off calls of fishermen, the laughter of children in distant courtyards. Life continued, even as pharaohs rose and fell. You bowed to the silence, and with that, your second hour ended. The third hour of your reign began not with a trumpet, nor a council, nor the shuffling of scrolls. It began with silence, a silence so thick, so reverent, it wrapped around your soul like linen on a mummy's brow. You were awakened by a servant girl whose name you had not yet learned. She bowed without looking at you and whispered only 3 words. "The mountain calls." They dressed you not in gold, but in humility. Plain robes, a cloak of dark linen, no crown. Just a carved staff, worn smooth from centuries of hands more powerful than yours. You were not being summoned as Pharaoh now. You were being summoned as supplicant. The journey was made on foot. Gabel Barkal, the holy mountain, loomed over the desert like a sleeping lion. From its jagged cliffs had come dreams, prophecies, and dread. It was believed the god Amun had descended here, not in fire, but in breath. A place where the boundary between man and divine was thinnest. You had passed this mountain before, many times, in fact, as a child, when you studied under priests and scribes, but now it felt entirely different, as though its gaze had changed, as though the rock itself was aware of your crown. At the mountain's base stood a temple carved directly into the stone, a cavernous sanctuary known as the House of Breath. You were led inside. your footsteps echoing like falling beads in the cool darkness. The air was rich with incense and ancient dust, and the walls were inscribed with prayers written in the curving tongue of the old Nubians. You entered alone. Kamudi, the high priest, had guided you to the entrance but refused to cross the threshold. The god must see you without witnesses, he said, if he sees you at all. The chamber was small, bare, save for a black altar and a single beam of light, falling from an unseen slit in the ceiling. You knelt and you waited. The silence was total, not oppressive, but vast. It was the kind of silence that lives at the bottom of wells, or in the deep of the desert where even jackals hesitate. You expected, hoped for a sign, a flicker, a whisper, a voice in your bones, but none came. Instead, you sat in stillness. Time passed oddly here. Hours became moments, moments became eternities, and somewhere in that twilight space, doubt began to crawl. You remembered stories of kings who had wept here, who had seen visions of glory, of conquest, of divine union. You thought of Tahaka, who claimed he saw Amun open his eyes beneath this very roof. You thought of Pie, who wept when the god touched his heart with flame. But for you, nothing. You opened your eyes. The beam of light had shifted. Dust motes danced in it lazily, like tiny spirits. You stood, hands clenched around the staff, and you asked aloud, "Do you not see me?" Your voice sounded alien in that sacred chamber. The words fell like pebbles into a bottomless well. You felt something inside you tighten. Not fear, but isolation. What if the god had turned his face away? What if your rule was not sanctioned? What if this silence was your answer? When you emerged, the sun was low in the west. The priests awaited. You, their faces calm, unreadable. Kamudi approached and studied your expression. "You saw?" he asked. You hesitated, and then you lied. "I saw," you said. He spoke. The high priest gave a slow, knowing nod. He did not press further. Perhaps he believed you. Perhaps he knew you had lied. Or perhaps, in the deep language of power, the truth no longer mattered. You returned to Napata under a sky of crimson and gold, the sun bleeding into the Nile like a wounded god. The city welcomed you not with cheers, but with quiet awe. The people stood along the roadways, heads bowed, hands over hearts. They did not ask what you had seen. They only assumed you had returned blessed, but the weight of silence still clung to your shoulders. That night, alone in your private chamber, you sat by a brazier and watched the coals breathe. You thought of the mountain, of that empty chamber, of the gods who had spoken to others, but not to you. And then a whisper, not divine, but human. It was Tien, the archivist. She had come bearing no scroll, no seal. Only a small clay tablet, older than the palaces. She bowed, then laid it beside you. "I thought you should see this," she said. "It's from the time of Pharaoh Alara, a record of his pilgrimage to Gebel Barkal." You picked it up. The cuneiform was faded, almost erased by time. "He too heard nothing," she said softly. "He spent the night beneath the mountain and returned in silence. But in his silence, he built. He made roads, granaries, laws. He ruled not by divine fire, but by human will." You looked at her. Her face was calm, but her eyes shimmered. "The gods do not always speak," she said, "but the people do." And with that, she departed. You sat for a long time, the tablet in your lap, the coals flickering like eyes that could not sleep. You were Pharaoh, maybe not because the gods had chosen you, maybe because you had chosen to carry what others could not. Outside, the wind stirred the palms, and inside, the silence began to feel, not cruel, but patient, waiting. By the 4th hour of your reign, the throne room had grown warm, not from fire, but from the encroaching weight of the southern sun, as if Ra himself leaned closer to see what kind of ruler now sat beneath the twin cobras. You were not idle. Since dawn, your fingers had pressed seals to clay, your ears had burned from the counsel of noble tongues, and your heart, still bound in silence from the mountain, had beat with a quiet determination. If the gods would not speak, then the stones must. It was Kamudi who summoned you this time, but not to the temple. He led you with few words to the valley just east of Napata, where the wind carried with it not incense, but the sharp scent of quarried stone and wet mortar. The construction site. Here, hundreds of men toiled beneath reed-woven shades. There, backs bent not in prayer, but in effort. Slaves, freemen, hired builders from as far as Elephantine, each one a thread in the tapestry of your growing kingdom. And at the center of it all stood a man as thin as papyrus, with skin like river clay, and eyes hidden beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. He was called Meni, the royal architect, Kamudi said. Appointed by Shabaka himself, he builds what even time must bow before. You approached him carefully. He did not bow. Instead, he turned and offered you a sliver of polished granite, smooth as glass. Your Majesty, Meni said, as if reciting, a fact. This will be the base of your new temple. Do you wish to leave your mark? He held out a stylus of bronze. Its tip was narrow, perfect for etching. Behind him, the stones waited like pages yet unwritten. You paused. In all your imagined visions of kingship, you had pictured gold, victory, parades. But now you understood. A pharaoh did not only command men, he commanded memory. Stone was eternal. It recorded what the wind could not. You took the stylus. On the granite surface, beneath the unflinching sun, you carved the first line of your reign, Tahaka's heir, who listened when heaven did not. Meni gave no compliment, only a slow nod. Then he took you through the site, his domain, his temple in the making. You passed columns yet unraised, lintels waiting for names, and rooms without roofs where birds made nests in corners that would one day echo with prayers. Building is like ruling, he said, voice low and steady. If the foundation shifts, everything falls. He showed you where the temple's axis would align with the rising sun during the solstice, where the shadow would fall upon the sacred pool, where sound would carry a priest's chant from one chamber to another with perfect clarity. Every inch must obey the stars, he said. Even stone must listen. You asked him, and what if the stars change? He smiled then, the first emotion you saw on his face. Then the pharaoh must hold still. By midday, your robes were damp with sweat, your sandals heavy with sand. You had not given orders of conquest. You had not judged a criminal. You had only walked among stones. And yet, you felt more pharaoh now than you had at the throne. You returned to the palace to find it restless. News had arrived from the north. A Kushite trade convoy traveling toward Memphis had been intercepted. No, one knew by whom. The scribes had tallied the loss: 40 bolts of linen, 12 crates of incense, 3 Nubian dancers meant for the court of a noble ally. But it was the last item that made your blood chill. A royal insignia was taken, the courier said, kneeling. A medallion bearing your image, gifted in your name. It wasn't just theft, it was mockery. You called a private council. This time, only 3 joined you: Kamudi, Tiene, and General Anok. Anok, still sore from your earlier refusal to strike, offered a plan of reprisal. We dispatch riders at once, hunt the thieves, make an example. Tiene, calmer, suggested patience. Wait, if it was bandits, they will resell the goods. We can track them. If it was a rival, they've just declared their hand. But Kamudi said nothing. He only looked at you. You're thinking of Gebel Barkal, you said aloud, surprising, even yourself. The silence. He nodded once. The gods test not with thunder, but with stillness. You faced your decision. Act now and risk chasing shadows, or wait and risk being seen as weak. And then, quietly, you turned to the stylus you had used that morning. It still rested beside your scrolls. You held it in your hand. "Send no riders," you said, "but double the guards on all royal convoys. Issue word to Memphis that we are watching. Let the next thief know they will be recorded, not hunted, but remembered." It was not the answer anyone expected, but it was yours. That night, you stood on the palace terrace. Below you, the city breathed. Fires flickered in courtyards. Mothers sang to sleeping babes. The river curled silently like a serpent of moonlight. Tiene joined you, unannounced. "You are changing," she said softly. "Or perhaps I'm becoming." You didn't flinch today. Even when tested, you smiled faintly. Stones do not flinch. They only listen. She looked toward the stars. And perhaps one day, the gods will answer, when you no longer need them to. You stayed there long after she left, the stylus still in your fingers, the wind cool against your brow. In the distance, the temple began to rise, stone by stone. And in its quiet climb, it whispered a truth older than kingship itself. To rule is to shape time. The Nile, in its serenity, holds many faces. To the weary, it is water and renewal. To the priest, it is the breath of gods. But to a pharaoh, on the 5th hour of his reign, it becomes a mirror too wide, too deep, too honest. You had ridden out that morning not in a litter, but aboard a bark, a wide, shallow vessel with sails of ochre linen and oars that moved like wings upon the water. It was a royal inspection, though none had spoken the word. You were to visit the Eastern Fishery, a cluster of settlements that traced the riverbank with woven huts, reed boats, and smoke that curled from cooking fires at dawn. The river was quiet, the way a lion is quiet before it moves. You stood beneath a canopy of cedar wood, the river breeze softening the heat that had already begun to gather in folds of your linen. At your side was Pesa, a Nubian fisherman appointed long ago by your predecessor, a man with dark, weather-worn skin and a voice like polished gravel. "These people," he said, nodding toward the banks where children bathed in the shallows, "they do not know who rules. They only know who listens." The comment lingered. You said nothing. It was not insult, it was invitation. The bark docked against a stretch of sand, where elders and younglings alike awaited your presence with palms pressed over their hearts. They bowed. Yes, but not in the way city courtiers did. Their reverence was not gilded in ceremony, but laced with fatigue and hope. They had gathered not to perform, but to ask. You stepped ashore, your sandals sinking slightly into the damp earth. A woman approached, perhaps 30, her arms lean from grinding grain, her eyes alert with an ache that came from carrying more than her share of years. "My Pharaoh," she said, and the title felt strange in her mouth, as though she had never needed it before. "Our fish are dying." You blinked. "From disease?" "No," said Pesa beside you, grim. "From salt." It was true. The Nile's recent flood, though lower than expected, had brought strange waters. Waters from the southern tributaries, heavy with minerals. Fish had floated belly up near the delta, and now, here, the smell of death lingered faint beneath the reeds. Another elder stepped forward. He held out a woven net, no longer taut with catch, but limp, a gesture not of offering, but of despair. "We feed the temples," he said. "We feed the cities, but who feeds us when the river turns?" You had no answer. You had brought no priest, no tribute, only yourself. But it was then that a child, a girl perhaps 7 years of age, stepped forward, clutching a clay pot. Inside, it swam a single fish, alive, eyes wide, gills fluttering in panic. "Not all are dead," she said, lifting the pot to you. Some want to live. The river wind caught your cloak. The oarsmen waited in silence behind you. And the people watched. You took the pot in your hands. Then I will listen, you said. You ordered records to be kept. You summoned 2 scribes from Napata, tasked not with writing laws, but with asking questions. You sent word to your priests, not to pray, but to test the waters. You would not offer appeasement. Not yet. You would offer attention. You left them, with the fish still swimming, its lone struggle now a symbol, if not a promise. Back on the bark, Pasa said nothing for some time. Then quietly, "You may be Pharaoh, but you are also fisherman now." You smiled. So be it. The return journey was slow. You watched the shores pass, watched farmers tend to their narrow plots, watched herons glide above the reeds. The Nile was always watching too. And then, a shadow in the water. It moved slow, just beneath the surface. No splash, no stir, just the ripple of presence. A crocodile. Pesa saw it too. "That one," he said, pointing, "is called Sutek's smile. Been haunting this bend for 30 years. Never seen, only felt." "Why do they let it live?" you asked. "Because it's older than anger, and wiser than revenge." You thought of your missing medallion, of the convoy ambushed in the north, of the silence at Gebel Barkal, of the architect and his foundation stones, of the child with the fish. And then you said, "Sometimes rulers should be feared, but not hated." Pesa nodded. "And sometimes they should be neither." By the time you returned to Napata, dusk had lowered its veil across the city. The sky was painted in indigo and blood, and torches burned along the palace's long corridors. You bathed in cool water, perfumed with hibiscus, and your limbs relaxed beneath the servants' care. But your mind remained afloat, drifting upon that quiet river, where crocodiles judged in silence. That night, you dined not in the royal hall, but in the garden, alone, and when Tiene found you there, seated beneath an acacia tree with ink on your fingers and the smell of Nile mud still in your hair, she paused. "You've seen the real kingdom now," she said. You nodded, "and it breathes differently." "You wrote again?" she asked, eyeing the scroll in your lap. You handed it to her. She read it aloud, softly. "When the gods close their mouths, the river speaks. When the people cannot feed the gods gods must listen. I am Pharaoh, but also potter, builder, fisher of lives." She looked up. "You'll be remembered." You stared into the sky. The stars were blinking awake. "I don't want to be remembered," you whispered. "I want them to survive." And in that quiet garden, with the Nile coiling in the distance, and the fish still swimming in a pot far downriver, the 5th hour of your reign came to an end. Not with fanfare, but with the first true sigh of peace. The 6th hour of your reign arrived not with sun or scrolls, but with footsteps, soft, certain, laced with the quiet gravity of someone who had never once needed permission to walk through a door. It was her, Nasala of Meroe. She entered your chamber, unannounced, flanked by no maidens, veiled by no formality. Even the guards had known better than to question her. Her presence was not that of an intruder. It was that of a storm returned to its homeland. She wore no crown, yet every fold of her indigo robe moved like a scepter's command. Her eyes, dark and clear as polished obsidian, met yours without hesitation. "I received your summons," she said, her voice low, textured with the desert's dusk. "But I would have come without it." You stood, uncertain whether to approach, her as consort, as equal, or as caution. "You are my queen," you said. "And you are Pharaoh," she replied. "But we have not yet spoken as rulers." There was no accusation in her tone, only observation. She did not sit. She waited. She studied the air between you like a tactician measuring wind before drawing her bow. You offered a seat beside the flame bowl. She accepted it. Not as a guest, but as someone reclaiming her place. "I know what you are facing," she began. They speak of it even in the northern gardens. The silence of Gebel Barkal, the unrest in Meroe, the missing medallion, the priests who watch too closely, and the generals who speak too little. You inhaled deeply. Then perhaps you also know what I do not. She tilted her head. Not what you do not. What you have not yet asked. You felt no sting from her words. Only recognition. Then let me ask now, you said. How do I rule a people who doubt my crown, while still listening to the child who offers me a single living fish? She did not answer quickly. Instead, she reached into the folds of her robe and retrieved a slender object, an ostrich feather, perfectly white, bound with a thread of lapis. This, she said, is the feather of Mart, the sign of truth, justice, order. My grandmother wore it during tribunal. My mother wore it when facing down a priest who tried to rewrite the tribute laws. I wear it now, not on my head, but in my hand. So I may choose whether to lift it or set it down. You watched as she placed the feather gently on the table between you. I will not kneel, she said plainly, not because I do not honor the throne, but because my spine has held kingdoms too long to bend without reason. Silence followed, deep, but not tense. You understood her. She was not defying you. She was offering something more valuable than submission. Clarity. I did not ask you to kneel, you said softly, but I will ask something more difficult. Her eyes narrowed slightly, curious. I want you to ride with me, you said, to Meroe. Not as a queen behind her king, but as one who ruled before him. The air between you shifted. The offer was dangerous. Empowering her meant changing the shape of your own shadow. But her reply came without pause. I will ride, ahead. Not beside me, you asked. No, she said. Let them see me first. Let them remember the woman who fed their fires and judged their quarrels before the Pharaoh's voice reached their ears. Let them greet their queen not in your name, but in mine. And then, when they have remembered me, they will see who I ride for now. You exhaled slowly. It was a bold gesture, but one you knew, in your bones, was wise. The 6th hour, you realized, was not about authority. It was about alliance. You were not building an empire of obedience. You were building an empire of memory, balance, and dignity. The following morning, you called your court together. There were murmurs, of course, whispers along the marble walls. Kamudi warned that too many eyes watched the royal household, that appearing divided would be seen as weakness. But Tiene, your archivist, said otherwise. In every dynasty, she said, there was always one who rode first. Sometimes the king, sometimes the queen. The records do not favor one over the other. They only favor the ones who dared. General Anok nodded, reluctantly. The people of Meroe are proud. Let them remember her, then remind them who chose her. That evening, as torches were lit along the palace colonnades, you stood in the doorway of the royal stables. Nasala was already there, adjusting the saddle of her horse. She wore traveling robes, practical but elegant. A circlet of ivory bound her hair. You approached slowly. You leave at dawn? I leave now, she said, climbing into the saddle, in one smooth motion. The moon is stronger than gossip. You offered her the feather. She looked at it, then looked at you. I will carry it, she said, but not for Mart. For what then? For the pharaoh who let his queen be, the wind. She spurred her mount, and without further word, galloped into the dusk, her silhouette framed by torchlight and rising dust, like a painting yet to dry. You stood there, long after she vanished, listening to the rhythm of her hooves fade into the night. And when the last echo was gone, you whispered to the air, let this hour be remembered. Not as the hour I commanded, but the hour I released. The 7th hour of your reign did not begin with ceremony, but with dust. Red, rust-hued dust, kicked high by hooves and wind. It clung to your robe, your lashes, the corners of your mouth. It settled into the folds of your saddle and the hollows of your thoughts. You had left Napata at first light, escorted not by trumpets and chariots, but by a narrow column of horsemen, silent and swift. You were not traveling as a deity, not as Pharaoh in divine pomp. You rode as a man, alert, exposed, and utterly committed to being seen as such. Nasala had left the night before, and her absence now shaped the journey like a star shapes a constellation. Her presence ahead of you was not an absence of loyalty. It was a bridge laid before your feet. You passed settlements where villagers emerged from date groves to stare, not in fear nor awe, but in wonder. A pharaoh on horseback was a tale they could tell their children. No litter, no canopy, no procession of flutes, just a dust-covered king and a determined rhythm of hooves. You did not stop to address them, but you looked into their faces, and you raised a hand, not in command, but in greeting, and they raised theirs in return. By midday, your company reached a narrow bend in the Nile where the river turned sluggish and wide. There, you stopped to rest and water the horses. The sun bore down like a hammer upon anvil, and the wind whispered secrets through the grass. Tiena, ever beside you now, unpacked a scroll. This bend, she said, was once the camp of Alara, first of the unified kings. He dreamed of one, river and one people, but never saw it fulfilled. You looked at the horizon, where the dunes blurred into heat. And did his dream die with him? No, she replied, but it did not follow him easily. His children fought, his priests doubted, the land splintered, but the dream remained, thin like thread, but unbroken. You nodded slowly. You, ride that same dream now, she added. And does it still fit? Tiena offered a wry smile. Dreams are never tailored to fit. They are worn until they shape the man. That evening you camped beneath a copse of acacia, their branches straining like prayerful hands. The soldiers pitched no tents. They slept on mats, wrapped in silence, the fire a single eye between them. You remained awake. Sleep teased, but did not claim you. Your mind replayed the silence of the mountain, the weight of the stone stylus, the child's fish, the whisper of the crocodile, and Nasala's shadow galloping ahead through darkness. You began to understand something older than your crown, deeper than your duty. The Nile could not be commanded, it could only be accompanied. Before the fire died, Tiena returned. She sat beside you, her robe the color of clay, her hair tied back in the style of temple initiates. I dreamed, she said. You glanced at her, that we reached Meroe, but we were not greeted by nobles or priests. We were met by a woman with ash on her forehead. She carried no gift, only a question. What did she ask? Tiena hesitated, then spoke softly. What did you leave behind to come here? The fire cracked once and went still. You lay down with those words in your mind. They settled like a stone in your chest, not heavy, but steady. You dreamed of a hawk flying low over the desert. Its wings clipped the dunes and stirred the bones of old kings buried beneath. It did not cry, it only flew, alone, yet never lost. At dawn you rose. The sky was pale with first light, and the chill of the desert still lingered in your breath. The city of Meroe was not far. A few hours more, your guards said. The land began to rise, slowly, as the flat plains gave way to gentle hills scarred with dark stone. The pyramids came first, small, steep, and many. Dozens of them, their sharp silhouettes piercing the horizon like teeth. Royal tombs of old, standing, in eternal council with the sun. You slowed your horse, struck by the austerity. No grand temples, no colonnades, just silence and stone. They are shorter than the Egyptian ones, a young rider whispered beside you. Yes, you replied, but they reach just as far. And then Meroe, She emerged from the hills as if carved from the earth herself, a city of contrasts. Gold markets beneath cloth canopies, iron furnaces exhaling smoke, palaces wreathed in shade, and streets where children raced barefoot between camel caravans and sandalwood stalls. And above it all, on a central rise, Nasala. She stood at the gates, alone, yet unafraid. Her horse was still, her robes clean despite the road, and her face calm as a judge of fate. You approached her not with trumpets, but with gratitude. She bowed, not deeply, just enough. You came, she said. You rode first, you replied. Together, you entered the city. The people parted slowly, not because they had been ordered to, but because they had chosen to. Their eyes searched you, not for power, but for recognition. And in that gaze, you gave them what they sought, a ruler who had ridden the dust with them, not above them. The 7th hour of your reign ended at the steps of the governor's house. A woman emerged, draped in white, her hands ink-stained, her necklace shaped like a serpent biting its own tail. Pharaoh, she said, her voice aged and steady. Meroe welcomes you, but Meroe has questions. You smiled. Then Meroe shall be answered. The 8th hour of your reign began behind closed doors, beneath a ceiling painted with falcons and flames. The council chamber of Meroe was smaller than Napata's, but heavier in air. Its walls were close, its silence guarded. This was not a place of proclamation. It was a place of negotiation, where voices were measured in weight, not volume. You were seated at the head of a low, crescent-shaped table carved from obsidian. In front of each seat was a small silver cup, empty, not as a slight, but as a statement. No one drank until words had passed, and no words passed until trust was shown. Across from you sat the governor of Meroe, Seret, matron of the house of Barkal's southern flame. She had ruled this city since the final years of your predecessor's reign, and had kept it from fracture not by force, but by ledger and law. Her hair was braided in long cords, each one tipped with a bead of copper. Her eyes, clouded with age, missed nothing. Beside her sat 3 nobles, Kashura, the iron merchant, Dietem, an elder priest, and Harkham, a former commander of the frontier, posts, now retired. Nasala sat to your right, her face unreadable. Tiene to your left, with her stylus already poised. Seret began. Pharaoh, she said, bowing slightly. Meroe honors your arrival, but honor alone does not grind grain. It does not reinforce walls. It does not quiet the mouths of the hungry. The others nodded, their faces still. You inclined your head. Then let us begin with what does. She raised her hand. A servant entered, bearing scrolls wrapped in colored string. Seret gestured, and the scrolls were placed before you. These are our ledgers for the past 5 seasons, she said. Read them not as a ruler, but as a man who drinks the same river we do. You unrolled the first. Tayena leaned closer, translating quickly. Grain shortfalls, lost labor to desertion, over-exerted iron kilns, temples asking for more offerings than they had in years prior. But most telling of all was a note at the margin, written in a cramped but steady hand. Loyalty endures until hunger grows teeth. You looked up. Who wrote this? You asked. Dietem, the priest, raised his hand. A temple acolyte. She has since been reassigned, but her words hold. And do you believe Meroe is disloyal? You asked quietly. No, Seret said, but I believe loyalty, like stone, cracks without care. You considered this, then gestured to the silver cups. May I? You asked. The nobles exchanged glances. Nasala gave a small nod. Seret at last waved her fingers. A second servant entered, bearing a pitcher of date wine cooled with crushed snow from the hills. Each cup was filled, in silence. You lifted yours. I drink, you said, to the people who work in fire, who sleep with hunger, who build a city even the gods envy. They raised theirs and drank. Then you spoke. I did not come to Meroe to command. I came to listen, and what I've heard is more honest than anything spoken at the foot of my throne. Keshura, the merchant, leaned forward. Then listen to this, Pharaoh. We do not wish to break away, but we will not be remembered only when tribute is needed. We forge your iron, we fill your scrolls, but we are still treated as a distant province. Nasala spoke next, soft but with edge. Meroe gave me its crown before Napata gave me a name. And I tell you this, if it is forgotten, it will forget in turn. Seret looked at you. Her fingers tapped slowly on the wood. Give us what we need, not as a gift but as recognition. You answered not with promises, but with parchment. You drew from your sleeve a scroll sealed with your signet. You had prepared it the night before, in that tent of flickering candlelight and dry wind. You unrolled it slowly, revealing your decree. Let Meroe govern its trade without interference from Napata's temple overseers. Let half its tribute remain within its walls. Let its governor report to the pharaoh directly, no intermediaries. Let its archives be housed with the same respect as the libraries of Napata. The chamber stilled. Even the fire in the corner seemed to quiet, as though, leaning in, Jetum blinked. You would break precedent? No, you said. I would restore memory, Keshura breathed out. Harkham scratched his beard, then nodded once, and Seret smiled. Then you are not like your predecessor, she said. I hope not, you replied. But judge me after Meroe is fed. The council ended with no applause, no cheers, just silence and respect, the kind of respect not offered, but earned. Later that evening, as dusk cooled the stone corridors, you walked alone, through the lower streets of Meroe, no guards, no fanfare, just you. You passed smiths whose arms were coated in soot, women weaving reed baskets by lantern light, children daring one another to leap across drainage ditches. One boy, noticing your robes, approached and said, "Are you the king?" You knelt before him. "No," you said gently. "Tonight, I'm only a guest." He reached out, touched the hem of your robe and whispered, "My mother says kings don't kneel." You smiled. "Then don't tell her." He laughed and ran. You watched him go, fast, barefooted, free. And then, quietly, you whispered too. "The stars. Let me be remembered, not for the gold I wear, but for the questions I dared to answer." The 8th hour of your reign ended not in court, but on cobblestones. Where kings once ruled from above, you chose to walk below. Morning in Meroe smelled of fire and honey. The kilns had been lit before first light, their chimneys exhaling grey ribbons of smoke into the still air. You stood atop a low tower, watching the city stretch and breathe beneath a sun still too soft to command. For a moment, you allowed yourself the illusion of peace. The wind carried voices, vendors setting baskets, priests chanting morning verses, the hammering of copper against stone. But beneath those notes was another current. A thin murmur, a warning just out of reach. It arrived with the sun's full rise, a rider, dust-caked, horse foaming, robe torn by thorns. He did not wait for ceremony. He bowed once, low, trembling, and extended a scroll bound in red cord. You knew what red cord meant. Urgent, royal, foreign. You broke the seal and read it in silence. Tien approached as you finished, her eyes narrowing. From Thebes, you nodded. From Thutmose, she waited. You handed her the scroll. Her lips moved silently as she read. Her face grew still. When she looked back at you, her voice was flat. "They've summoned you to answer for silence." "Yes," you replied. Thutmose's message, penned in perfect Kushite script, had been courteous, in tone, but beneath its etiquette, the threat was unmistakable. A faction in the Egyptian court, led by merchants and lesser priests, had grown restless. They claimed your absence from the festival of Ra in Thebes was a slight, They whispered that Cush had forgotten its northern brothers, that the Black Pharaoh grew arrogant. That unity was only dust in royal tombs. You stared at the horizon, where the Nile wound northward like a coiled thought. I have ruled 9 hours, you said, and already Egypt questions my silence. Tiene replied, because silence frightens those who cannot control it. You left the tower quietly. By midday, you gathered your inner circle in the shaded courtyard of Meroa's archive, a place of reed scrolls and stone tablets, where librarians moved like acolytes and the past breathed through walls. Nasala was there already, seated with one leg crossed over the other, examining a map of the Nile Valley. Seret arrived soon after, flanked by her scribe. And then Anok, your general, weary from the ride, dust still clinging to his armor. You unrolled Thutmose's letter on a sandstone table. They call for tribute, you said, and presents. They call for proof of fealty, not in offerings, but in attendance. Anok scoffed. So now Thebes commands its pharaoh like a dog on a leash. They fear, said Nasala, that we remember who we were before they claimed. To teach us how to rule, Tiene added, and perhaps they fear we no longer need them. You tapped the table, once, lightly. The question, you said, is not whether we should answer. It is how. Silence followed. Then Seret spoke, her voice slow and dry as old papyrus. Let them wait. You turned to her, eyebrow raised. Let them feel what they accuse you of. Absence. Let silence be your envoy. You mean to provoke them? Anok asked. No, she said. To reflect them. Egypt understands mirrors better than messengers. It was bold, dangerous, and poetic. But the wind shifted again that evening. A second message arrived, not from Thebes, but from the Nubian border, where the Kushite frontier met the southern sea. A minor fort had been abandoned, 2 scouts missing. The messenger's voice trembled as he knelt. They left behind no blood, no battle, just this. He held up a medallion, your likeness, burned, not stolen, not ransomed, desecrated. You took it in your hands. It was warm from his journey, but chilled you nonetheless. Who? Anok asked, already pacing. Nomads? Raiders? Or, Nasala murmured, those who listen in silence. Tiene stepped forward, holding the medallion close. This wasn't for us, she said. This was for whoever finds it next, a symbol, a seed. You looked to the horizon again. Symbols. They moved faster than men, faster than chariots, faster than truth. You dismissed the council gently that evening, giving orders without raising your voice. Anok would reinforce the southern roads. Seret would send word to her northern counterparts, quietly. Nasala would return to Napata ahead of you to keep the throne warm. You remained alone. The stars blinked into the sky one by one, like gods who had grown old and tired, still watching, but rarely interfering. You walked through the sleeping city, the moonlight casting your shadow long upon the walls. Meroa rested, but your soul wandered. You passed a weaver's hut, a temple gate, a fountain where 2 clay jars stood, catching dew. You paused. From somewhere within the shadows came a voice, soft, unfamiliar. Are you him? You turned. A woman stood there, older than your mother, wrapped in a shawl the color of night. Her eyes were grey with time, but her spine straight as justice. I've seen 5 pharaohs come and go, she said, but none ever walked these streets without drums. You nodded. Then perhaps I am the first to walk in question. She smiled. Questions last longer than answers. You knelt, not out of humility, but clarity. What do you see in me? You asked. She stepped closer. A boy who wears stone like silk and silence like a spear. You looked at her for a long time. Then, gently, you rose. The medallion still hung from your belt, and in your heart, A thought took root. The gods may not speak, but symbols do. The 9th hour of your reign faded not into darkness, but into thought. Tomorrow, you would return to Napata, but tonight, you stood still long enough to be changed. The 10th hour of your reign began with departure, not the triumphant kind sung by bards, but the quiet slipping away of a ruler beneath dawn's hush. Meroa did not send banners, no drums, no farewell procession, only a dozen watchful eyes above, woven shutters, and a handful of craftsmen bowing once as you passed. The city had spoken with its questions, and you had answered not with pride, but with presence. And presence, as you now understood, lingered longer than promise. Your horse stepped softly over packed earth, and soon the city was behind you. Only, the pyramids remained in your line of sight for miles, those steep, sharp monuments that had outlasted 10 dynasties. You rode mostly in silence. Tiena was beside you, her scroll satchel fastened tight against her hip. She had changed during the journey. Her voice had grown more sparing, her eyes more searching. "The medallion," she said after some time. "Do you still carry it?" You reached for the pouch at your side, where the burned symbol of your face lay wrapped in linen. "I do," you replied. "Why not discard it?" You studied the horizon. "Because it's honest," you said. "It tells me who I am to those who wait beyond our walls. And who is that? An idea they wish to bury before it takes root." She nodded and said no more. By the second day, the landscape softened. The red sands gave way to golden plains where acacias dotted the horizon like forgotten torches. Goat herds waved as you passed. You waved back. Their goats ignored you. Near the third evening, you came upon the ruins of an old way station, a cluster of sunken stones and a collapsed wooden archway where once royal messengers had paused to change horses. Now, it belonged to lizards and silence. You camped there. The fire was modest, but warm. Tiena read quietly from a tablet, and you took a few moments to walk among the broken stones. There, among the rubble, your foot struck something small. A cup, plain, cracked, half buried. You picked it up, brushing sand from its lip. A message had been scratched into the side, faint but legible. "He who drinks alone forgets twice." You smiled faintly. In Napata, a pharaoh never drank alone. He was surrounded by priests, advisors, courtiers, voices that clashed like cymbals and whispered like snakes. But out here, you lifted the cup to the wind and drank nothing. Still, something within you was quenched. That night, Tiena joined you by the fire, uncharacteristically talkative. "Did you know," she said, "that in the First Kingdom, a king once ruled for only 7 days?" You looked at her, interested. "He was crowned during a drought," she continued, "and offered himself to the gods at the end of the week. They say the rains came on the morning of his sacrifice." "Was it coincidence?" She shrugged. "Or belief, but they carved his name into obsidian. Shortest reign, longest memory. You thought of your own name, carved now in granite above the temple's threshold, inscribed in Meroa's new decree, echoed in the prayers of soldiers, children, the old woman in the alley. 10 hours. That's all it had been. And yet, it felt like lifetimes had passed between the crown and now. By dawn of the 4th day, the hills surrounding Napata appeared like sleeping gods on the horizon. Your party crested a ridge, and the full view of the capital unfolded before you. Even from a distance, something was different. You felt it before you saw it. The smoke, thin, dark, not from cooking fires or incense. This smoke curled like suspicion. You urged your horse forward, the others behind you quickening their pace. As you drew near, a young runner, barefoot, gasping, came racing up the path. He collapsed before your horse, breathless. You leapt down to lift him. "My lord, the temple," he panted. "What of it?" "Broken into, statues, defaced, the sacred pool, tainted." Your jaw clenched. "Who?" We don't know. They left no sign. Only words. He handed you a strip of linen smeared with pigment. Tiena leaned in. The words were simple. The gods see nothing. You said nothing. Not yet. Your arrival in Napata was not triumphant. The streets were half empty, lined with nervous eyes. The temple doors stood ajar, their guardians gone. The Queen Mother's attendants met you at the gates, pale-faced, whispering of omens and unrest. Kamudi, the high priest, waited inside the hall of Heka. He bowed, but briefly. You returned to questions, he said. Then we begin again, you replied. He nodded. The people are afraid. So am I, you said. And that is why we must act. You turned to your guard. Seal the temple. Let no one enter, not priest, not servant, not pharaoh. Kamudi's face darkened. You would exile the gods? No, you said quietly. I would give them silence to answer in. You walked to the great courtyard and stood beneath the evening sky. Napata stretched before you, bruised but breathing. You unwrapped the medallion from your pouch, held it high, and cast it into the sacred pool. A ripple spread and was gone. The 10th hour of your reign ended, not in glory or despair. It ended in stillness. The kind of stillness just before a storm dares to speak. The 11th hour of your reign opened with a whisper, not from wind or voice, but from within. The sacred pool remained still, save for the ripple your medallion had cast. The water, once fragrant with lotus and myrrh, now carried a bitter scent, as if touched by something unspoken. Even the priests walked around it in silence, as if the reflection itself might accuse them. You did not enter the temple. Instead, you observed from the Hall of Shade a covered walkway just beyond the courtyard, once reserved for scribes and apprentices. Here, the columns bore the names of kings long dust, their hieroglyphs faded but not forgotten. Tiena sat beside you, her ink-stained fingers resting in her lap. They will ask for ritual, she said, and if I deny them, they'll say, the gods have turned from you. And if I comply, they'll say you've returned to them too late. You breathed in the air, warm, dry, slightly metallic. Somewhere nearby, incense smoldered, trying and failing to mask the rot beneath. Nasala had returned from Meroa the night before. She found you at dusk, seated alone by the riverbank. Her voice, when she spoke, was not of a queen's, but of a woman remembering her mother's hands washing clothes in this very stream. This place, she said, was not always sacred. It became sacred because someone believed it was. You had looked up at her, uncertain. Do we still believe? She did not answer with certainty. Instead, she dipped her hands into the water. I believe in the people who walk miles for a single jar of this, she said. That belief has weight, whether the gods drink it or not. Now, as the priests prepared the great purification rite, the same rite that had once blessed Taharka's sandals, you watched their faces, strained, determined, but lacking the fire of true conviction. Even Kamudi's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the ceremonial implements. A golden bowl, a reed whisk, a sunstone. In theory, these items invoked Amun's favor. In practice, they had become performance. You rose and entered the temple. The room grew still. The chief lector priest turned, his painted brow furrowed in something between confusion and reverence. Your Majesty, the rites are not complete. They are finished, you said, softly but firmly. And they will not be performed today. Gasps followed. Kamudi stepped forward. Pharaoh, the city needs a sign. They need assurance. No, you replied. They need honesty. You walked to the base of the inner sanctum, where the statue of Amun stood cloaked in linen and gold leaf, his eyes of lapis staring into eternity. You bowed, not in worship, but in memory. I ask not for rain, you whispered, nor for harvest, I ask only that you remain, if you ever were. Then you turned and faced the gathered clergy. This chamber is closed until the gods speak, or until we no longer. Wait for them. Kamudi looked as though he might crumble. The people will fall into panic, he warned. No, said Tieni, who had quietly entered behind you. They've lived in panic. This is truth. You left the temple to the sound of your own heartbeat. No drums, no prayers. Just the hush of men who had run out of incantations. That night, you called a gathering, not of nobles or priests, but of workers. You met them in the court of measures, where weights and scales had long been kept, beneath a simple, linen canopy hung with lanterns. 50 citizens came, farmers, bakers, water carriers, scribes, metal workers. No throne, no announcement, just mats upon the ground and a single low fire. They looked at you, not with awe, but with curiosity. You spoke first. The gods are quiet, you said, but we are not. Tell me, what do you need? For a long moment, no one answered. Then, an old man stepped forward, his skin like dry leather, his fingers stained from years of tanning hides. I need shoes for my grandson, he said. He walks to school barefoot. Others followed. A woman with tired eyes. We need oil. The temple keeps most of it for lamps. A young man with soot-blackened hands. We need stronger reeds for scaffolding. Last week one snapped. My brother fell. None asked for gold. None asked for omens. They asked for grain, for safety, for a voice. And you realized this was the kingdom, not the columns, not the scrolls. Here, in this circle of need. The next day, you sent word to the temple. Half the oil rations were to be redistributed. You ordered an audit of construction tools. New sandals were issued from royal stores. And a single empty chamber, in the palace, once used for embalming texts, was open to serve as a forum. No idols, no ceremony, just space. Some priests protested. Kamudi remained silent, but the people came. And in that space, slowly, a new kind of faith began to take shape. Not of gods who lived behind doors of gold, but of hands that built and voices that asked. That evening, you returned to the sacred pool. Alone. You sat by its edge, watching the surface reflect the firelight behind you, and you spoke, though not aloud. If you are there, then dwell in us. If you are not, then let us be divine to one another. The 11th hour of your reign ended not in flame, nor in collapse, but in a breath. Deep, steady, a breath not taken in fear, but in beginning. The 12th hour of your reign began before the first bird cried to the sun. The air was still cool, the city still hushed in its sleep, but somewhere, behind the walls of mud-brick homes and papyrus awnings, footsteps stirred. Not the practiced shuffle of guards, nor the hushed bustle of servants preparing grain. These were quieter, intentional, bare. You were not summoned to the palace steps. No horns called you, no priest offered omen. But when Tiene came to your chamber, her eyes wide and voice soft, you knew something had moved that had not moved in generations. They're gathering, she said. You did not ask who. You only rose. Outside, the eastern sky had begun to glow, a soft apricot hue spilling across the whitewashed stones. The breeze that blew through Napata was faint, but held a promise of heat to come. And in the great square before the palace, they waited. Hundreds of them. Some still in work robes, others wrapped in cloaks worn thin by time. Children pressed, close to mothers, old men leaned on staffs, and somewhere among them, a young boy held a bunch of river lilies like a torch. No one spoke, no one sang, and no one wore sandals. You stood behind the lattice screen of the upper colonnade, watching it. Was not a protest, nor a celebration, it was a presence. You turned to Tiana, who now stood beside you, her hands trembling slightly around her stylus. Have we called this? You asked. She shook her head. No, my lord. I think they've called us. And so you stepped out, not in gold-threaded robes, not with bodyguards flanking your sides. You stepped out barefoot, in plain linen, your hair unbraided, your brow free of the cobra and sun disk. The crowd parted with reverence, not fear. You walked slowly, your feet against the warm stones, feeling the same earth they felt. Dust clung to your ankles. The scent of human closeness, of morning skin and shared breath rose around you. A woman stepped forward first. She wore no jewelry. Her hands were cracked from grinding grain. She bowed, but not deeply, and from her shawl she drew a piece of bread, small, round, wrapped in a square of dyed cloth. She placed it in your hands and said, "Not for offering, for eating." You accepted it, not as a king, but as one who was hungry for meaning. A child came next. He held a river stone, smooth and cool. He placed it on your open palm and looked up at you with eyes too solemn for his age. "It's lucky," he whispered. You held onto it, tightly. More followed, not with riches, but with pieces of themselves. A single red bead, a carving of a fishbone, comb, a stitched patch of cloth, a plucked reed, and through it all, no one raised their voice. No one asked for anything. They simply gave, and in their giving, they revealed something that not even the priests had shown you. Their belief had not died. It had merely stopped waiting for gods. You stood in the center of the crowd, encircled not by walls or guards, but by expectation. And you spoke. Your voice was low. You made no attempt to lift it beyond the stillness. I walked into the temple and heard nothing. I asked the gods to speak, and they were silent. But now I see. You opened your hands, showing the gifts. They were speaking. Here, all along, a murmur passed through the crowd. Not surprise, not shock, but something like a long breath being released. A relief not of fear ending, but of being seen. You knelt, there, barefoot and crownless. You bent your knees upon the dust, and the people knelt with you, not all, not in unison, but in slow, scattered ripples. As if each heart asked its own permission first. It was not a ceremony. It was not a spectacle. It was recognition. The sound that followed was not song. It was more ancient. The rustle of linen, the hush of sandals, lifted in hand. The gentle rhythm of breath aligned without command. You remained in the square for hours. Some wept, some laughed, some simply sat near you and said nothing at all. When the sun reached its peak, Tien brought water in a plain clay jar. You drank, then passed it. The jar made its way through dozens of hands until it returned empty, but fuller than it began. Later, that evening, as the crowd thinned and the stars began to prick the sky, Nasala came to your side. She had said nothing all day. Now she looked at your dust-covered feet and smiled faintly. "You realize," she said, "that you cannot walk backward. From this." You nodded. "Good. I don't intend to. The priests will call this blasphemy. They've called quieter things heresy. And the Queen Mother. She will remember that barefoot kings built the first cities." Nasala took your hand, not out of affection, but alliance. She pressed something into your palm. It was her crown. "I won't wear it tomorrow," she said. "Not until I've earned it again." You looked at the circlet of carved ivory and lapis, then folded your fingers around it, carefully, gratefully. That night, back in the quiet of your chamber, you placed all the gifts upon a woven mat: stone, bread, bead, cloth. You sat beside them in silence. You thought of thrones, of sandals, of footprints that lingered longer than banners. You whispered, not to gods, but to the dark, "If I rule at all, let it be with dust on my soles and their names in my heart." And so, the 12th hour of your reign did not end with decree, nor vision, nor command. It ended with bare feet on warm stone, and the knowledge that power, when truly seen, does not need armor at all. The 13th hour of your reign arrived with no trumpet, no runner, no blood. It arrived instead in the rustling of olive branches and in the quiet eyes of those who bowed too low, or not at all. Peace, as you had come to learn, did not hum like a lyre string. It creaked like old wood. It moved slowly, like oil spilled on stone, and sometimes it pretended to sleep. You had risen early, before the smoke of the bakeries curled into the air. The day before had given you hope, bare feet and gifts freely, offered the warm hush of a crowd who saw you not as a god, but as a guide. But today, the city's breath felt different. You sat beneath an ancient olive tree in the garden behind the palace. Its limbs were gnarled, twisted by centuries of sun, and its shade spread in a wide embrace. Here, kings had sat before. Some prayed, some plotted, some wept. Tiene joined you with a bundle of fresh reeds and a message sealed in yellow wax. She said nothing at first, simply placed the message on the low table beside you. You broke the seal, a single slip of parchment. 4 words. The walls have ears. You looked up. Who sent this? You asked. No name, she replied. Only a symbol. The knot of Amara. You stiffened slightly. The knot of Amara was an old sigil, belonging once to a scribes' guild, that had been disbanded 2 reigns ago, after their scrolls predicted drought before the priests did. Some said their truths had been too accurate. Others said they had only written what everyone was afraid to speak. You examined the parchment again. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, not a warning in fear, but in loyalty. Then it has begun, you murmured. Tiene didn't ask what. She already knew. You were not the only one walking barefoot now. Your gestures, small, symbolic, had stirred a deeper unrest than thunder ever could. The high temple still stood closed, and its silence had grown teeth. Priests murmured behind curtains. Scribes huddled in groups, no longer copying decrees, but composing alternatives. Even palace guards, once statuesque in discipline, now cast sidelong glances not born of reverence, but calculation. You rose. Send word to Kamudi, you said. Ask him to meet me at midday, beneath this tree. Tiene hesitated. Will he come? If he doesn't, you said, then we are already too late. You spent the morning walking the corridors of the palace, corridors you once thought belonged to you. Now, you notice things you hadn't before. The fading in the murals where fingers had touched too often, the way servants whispered more than they moved, the scroll cubbies that had once been full, now half empty. At midday, Kamudi came. He walked with purpose, not speed, not hesitation, simply a man who knew his role and had not yet chosen to leave it. He bowed, though less deeply than usual. My Pharaoh, he said. You gestured to the seat across from yours. High priest. He sat, the folds of his robe rustling like dry leaves. Between you lay a bowl of olives, a carafe of water, and no guards. I received your silence, he said. As did I yours, you replied. He looked at you, not with anger, but with something older. We serve different gods now, it seems. You shook your head. We serve the same people, and yet your temple is the street, because the gods have not spoken from yours. He nodded slowly. Or perhaps you no longer hear them. You let the words settle. There was no venom in his voice, only grief. I never sought to tear down the altars, you said, only to keep them from crumbling under neglect. Kamudi picked up an olive, rolled it between his fingers, but did not eat it. There are scrolls, he said, from Thebes, from Elephantine, even from beyond the desert, where the sun sets faster and returns with questions. You met his gaze. And what do they ask? He looked away. They ask what kind of pharaoh does not demand sacrifice. You stood gently, the kind who has already sacrificed certainty. Kamudi did not rise. He only whispered, they will come, not with armies, but with stories, and stories are sharp, my king. You nodded. Then I must sharpen my silence. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the garden in amber and copper, you walked alone through the temple corridor. Its doors remained shut, its incense unburned. But beneath its steps, you felt the stir of something, not divine, not spectral, dissent. It was not loud, but neither was it sleeping. You returned to your chamber and found a gift waiting. A bowl of dates, a piece of cloth embroidered with the symbol of Amun, and a note. Even silence can starve the soul. Speak soon. It was unsigned, but you recognized the hand, the Queen Mother. You held the cloth for a long time before setting it aside. Then, you opened the windows wide and let the night in. You sat at the edge of your bed, feet bare against the floor, and whispered, to the dark once more, let my reign not depend on thunder, but on the echo of my steps in rooms where gods no longer dwell, yet truth still waits beneath the olive tree. And so, the 13th hour of your reign ended not in battle, but in shadow, where trust and tradition stood face to face, and neither bowed. The 14th hour of your reign began in a corridor rarely tread. It lay behind the temple district, between two crumbling storehouses where scrolls were once sorted by moonlight. Few knew of its passage now, only the oldest scribes, those whose eyes had dimmed, but whose memories burned brighter than ever. You were led there by Tien just after dawn. She did not speak, only handed you a reed lantern and walked 2 paces ahead. The walls grew narrower, the air denser. The scent of mildew mingled with ink and something ancient, charred parchment perhaps, or the slow decay of words left unread. At last, the corridor opened into a chamber, circular, modest in size. No throne, no altar, only shelves, low, crooked, filled with tablets, bound reeds, and fragments of histories long denied sunlight. And in the center, seated on a reed mat, was a man. He was older than the high priest, older than the Queen Mother, perhaps even older than the chamber itself. His name, as Tiena later told you, was Asatem. Once, he had been the royal archivist under a pharaoh 3 reigns before yours. When the temples accused him of heresy, after he questioned the reliability of sacred records, he was quietly removed, not executed. That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, they buried him in scrolls and left him there. He looked up now with eyes pale and steady. You walk like a king, he said. You bowed, not deeply, just enough. I rule like a man, you replied. He smiled. That's worse. You sat before him, the lantern flickering between you. Tiena withdrew, leaving only the rustle of reed and the breath of time between your words. I've come for something I cannot name, you admitted. Asetum nodded. That is the only thing worth seeking. He reached beside him and drew a tablet, not stone, not papyrus. It was clay, hardened in fire, the surface etched with markings too old for your eye. This, he said, was once read aloud at coronations. You leaned in. It speaks not of gods, he continued, but of gravity, of how every crown bends the neck, not just the spine, of how the sky does not rise to meet a king, but waits to see if he will lower his gaze. You touched the tablet. It was warm, as if it still remembered the kiln. Why was it hidden? You asked. Because it speaks of service, not divinity, Asetum answered. And men in temples do not sell service, they sell mystery. He gestured around the chamber. All of this, he said, was once deemed unnecessary, too rational, too real. You scanned the shelves, volumes on irrigation cycles before ritual calendars, treatises on medicine that cited herbalists, not priests, histories written by midwives, traders, and weavers. It was a library not of what kings had wanted to hear, but of what had happened when they didn't. I cannot rebuild the past, you said. No, Asetum agreed, but you can refuse to lie about it. You stayed with him for hours, He told you of a pharaoh who once abolished the calendar for a season, so the rains could be counted by eyes, not stars. Of a queen who fed every orphan in her district before, funding a single altar. Of a war that never happened, but was written into 20 scrolls to justify a rise in temple tithe. Each tale stripped something from you, but each also gave something new. When at last you rose to leave, Asetem did not offer a blessing, he offered a warning. You will be accused of forgetting the gods, he said. I know. They will say you mock the divine. I do not. But you will walk forward. I must. He looked into your face, and for the first time, bowed. That evening, you summoned your court. You wore no crown, only the plain robe you had worn to the square. Nasala sat beside you, her hair unbraided. Kamudi entered last, slower than before, his expression unreadable. You spoke calmly. I have walked the streets. I have listened in the courts. And today, I sat with a man who has remembered more than we ever wrote. A pause. You looked at Kamudi. There are truths outside the temples, you said, and they do not contradict the gods. They complete them. He said nothing, but his hands tightened around the edge of his seat. You continued. We must open the doors of knowledge, every scroll, every stone. Let the people see the patterns that govern their water, their food, their breath. Let them not only worship, but understand. Whispers followed. But not outrage, only uncertainty. You concluded with this. I do not deny the divine. I only refuse to hide behind it. And then you stood, dismissed no one, commanded nothing. You simply left the room. And in the silence that followed, the court realized something terrifying. You had just shifted power, without raising your voice. Later, in the solitude of your chamber, you read the clay tablet again. The words were rough, uneven, but one line stood out. Let no man rise so high that he cannot hear a whisper from the dust. You placed it by your bedside and whispered once more to the dark. Let them question my crown. Let them question my voice. But never let them say, I feared the truth. Thus ended the 14th hour of your reign, not in revolt, nor riot, but in revelation, and the dust beneath your feet had never felt more sacred. The 15th hour of your reign began with the smell of salt and horses. It came not from the palace nor the temple district, but from the southern gate, where the river dipped and the sands grew coarser, and where those who arrived carried the heat of long roads on their backs. You had just broken fast, dates and barley bread, shared with Nasala beneath the awning of the western portico, when a guard arrived, flushed and flustered. My king, he said, voice trembling. There is a woman at the gate. She bears the sigil of Meroe. She carries no weapon. She asks for no escort. You exchanged glances with Nasala. Does she name herself? She asked. No, the guard replied. Only said she was once known. To you. Your thoughts narrowed, and you stood. You walked to the southern gate unguarded, your robes tucked for travel, sandals unfastened. The crowd parted as you passed, some bowing, some watching in silence, unsure if what they saw was majesty or curiosity. The woman stood beneath a shade tree just beyond the city wall. She was older than you remembered, but her posture remained, proud. Her skin was the color of sun-baked clay, and her hair, once braided with shell beads, was now bound in a single wrap of dyed linen. Her eyes met yours without hesitation. She bowed, not deeply, not humbly, but with precision. My pharaoh, she said. You looked closer, and memory struck. Anin, you said, the name tasting of lost seasons and moonlit riverbanks. She had once been your companion in the temple school, sharp-tongued, quick-witted, defiant, the first to question a lesson, the last to leave the study mat. She had vanished before your 10th naming rite, sent away by her family for reasons never whispered aloud. And now she returned, not as a friend, but as a message. "Why are you here?" you asked. She stepped forward and unrolled a small cloth bundle. Within it, sealed in wax, lay a single reed scroll. No name, no crest, only a symbol, 2 crossed sickles. You recognized it, not as a house, not as a region, but as a movement. "The harvest circle," you said, softly. Anin nodded. You took the scroll, broke the seal, read, then read again. Nasala approached behind you, eyes wary. "What is it?" she asked. You passed her the scroll. She read aloud. "When the fields go tilled but the temples feast, when voices rise and ears retreat, when the scepter forgets the soil remembers." Beneath it, a second line, hastily inked. "We will not wait for thrones to listen." You turned to Anin. "Is this a threat?" "No," she said. "It's a declaration. You carry it openly?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because hiding it would mean we fear what you've become." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "But we don't." You stared at her, searching her face for irony, for trap, for tremble. None. Only truth. "They think I've forgotten them?" you asked. "They think you remember too little and too late." You looked down at the scroll again. The ink was smudged, at the edge, as if carried across too many hands. "How many read this before me?" "Hundreds." You closed your eyes. The Harvest Circle had once been a network of farmers and scribes, formed in years of poor flood, when temple records failed to account for grain shortages. They mapped scarcity, whispered warnings, created lines of communication between villages forgotten by tribute caravans. They were not revolutionaries, but they remembered how to become one. You turned back to Anin. "What would they have me do?" She tilted her head, thoughtful. "Not rule louder, rule closer." You inhaled slowly. "What do they fear?" "That silence will become ritual." You thanked her, not with words, but with stillness. Then you gave her a single token, a ring carved from olive wood, shaped like a listening ear. "Tell them I am not waiting," you said. "I am walking." She accepted it, turned, and disappeared into the dust. You returned to the palace slowly. Nasala said little until you reached the water garden. Then, as the frogs began their chorus, she spoke. "She believes in you. She believes in the part of me I haven't used yet." She gave you a choice. "No," you said. "She gave me a mirror. That night, you called a gathering. Not of the court, not of the temple, of the messengers. All of them. From every district, every road, every outpost. They arrived by torchlight, confused, whispering. You greeted them in the courtyard, barefoot, once more, scroll in hand. You read the poem aloud. No edits, no censorship. Then you said, "Starting tomorrow, every third message you carry will be mine. A message of listening, of walking, of being present before I am needed. We will not wait until the harvest wilts. We will walk while it still grows." And then, one by one, you gave them rings, carved from olive wood, silent but shaped like ears. Symbols not of command, but of commitment. The 15th hour of your reign ended not in rebellion, nor in retreat, but in dust, rising from 100, sandals, and the slow, deliberate steps of a king choosing to hear before he speaks. The 16th hour of your reign did not begin with gold, nor ink, nor decree. It began with dust, thick, warm, and rising. It clung to your sandals and eyebrows, softened the folds of your linen robe, and whispered through your nose as the wind swept through the western plain, where the hills sloped into forgotten valleys, and the voices of old kings were buried in silence. There was no throne here, no temple gate, no incense curling from copper bowls, only a wall of untouched stone, reddish and flecked with dark quartz, its surface cracked with time but not yet claimed. Seta Meket, the stone that sees the future. They had told you stories of it when you were young, legends of a cliff that faced no river, no city, no temple, a cliff that spoke only twice a year, when the sun rose directly before it and painted its face gold. They said the old kings stood before it with bare feet and closed eyes, waiting for vision. Not prophecy, not command, but vision. You arrived before the light touched it and waited. No entourage, only Tiana beside you, carrying a scroll case and an expression of cautious reverence. "Do you believe it speaks?" she asked. You watched the wind ripple across the surface like breath. "Not in words," you said, "but maybe in questions." As the sun lifted, its first beam struck the stone. Slowly, the color changed, from dull to fire. It shimmered. Not brightly, but clearly, and that was enough. You stepped forward and placed your palm against its surface. It was warm and ancient and waiting. "I want to leave behind something they can see," you said aloud, "something they don't need priests to interpret." Tiana unrolled a scroll. It held rough sketches, not of gods, nor symbols of divine order, but of people. A woman nursing her child, a farmer pushing seed into soil, a boy teaching another to write. Each face was left unfinished, each body grounded in work, not ritual. "I want them carved here," you said, "not on temple walls. Here, where no one comes for worship, only for witness." Tiana nodded. She wrote the words in the margin. "This is not a monument. This is a memory in stone." You summoned artisans, not from the royal court, but from the lower districts. Masons who etched names onto grave markers, who carved out warnings on city wells, who knew how to work not for glory, but for clarity. When they arrived, they stood before the cliff in quiet awe. Then, slowly, they began, not with chisels, with charcoal, with outlines. They drew the first figure, a woman kneeling with her hands in grain, eyes half closed in concentration. Then a man teaching a child to use a straight edge. Then a pair of hands reaching, one, open, one, not from the sky, but from the same level, and at the edge of all, a set of footprints, alone, leading forward. When the masons asked whose feet they were, you said, "Yours," and they smiled. Not out of pride, but understanding. For 3 days, the work continued. By the second morning, word had reached the city, and they came, not in crowds, not in caravans, but in twos, in threes. Mothers with children on their backs, builders on rest breaks, young scribes, faces smudged with ash and ore. They sat quietly, watching the stone take shape. No guards barred them, no priests officiated. It became a ritual without ceremony, a reverence born not of fear, but of belonging. On the 4th day, an elder man arrived, stooped and silent. He carried a small basket, from which he took a flat, carved token, stone smoothed into the shape of a hand, fingers slightly curled. He placed it on the ground before the wall and whispered, "I have waited 50 years to see something like this." You asked his name. He said, "Let the wall carry it," and left. You had known many kinds of silence in your reign. Temple silence, political silence, angry silence. But this was the silence of agreement, of many hearts saying yes without needing a voice. That night, back in your quarters, Nasala joined you beneath the open sky. You pointed toward the hills. She asked, "Is it finished?" You shook your head. "It must never be finished." She raised an eyebrow. You explained, "If it ends, they will enshrine it. They will name it sacred. They will turn it into law." She smiled. "You want it to breathe. I want it to remain open, like a door." She leaned closer, whispering, "Then carve no key." The next morning, before the light touched the stone, you etched your own mark, small, beside the footprints. A single line in the shape of an ear. "Let them know," you whispered, "that I listened." That afternoon, a scroll arrived. No seal, just 2 words. "We saw." You did not need to ask who had sent it. They were watching. From the north. From Thebes. From the shadows of tradition. But now they watched something else too. A wall. A people. A pharaoh who did not point from above, but walked beside. The 16th hour of your reign ended not in declaration, nor triumph, but in stone shaped by many hands. And the quiet knowledge that to lead is not always to command. Sometimes it is simply to leave space for others to be remembered. The 17th hour of your reign began in reflection, not in thought, but in bronze. You found yourself standing before a polished basin, the water still and cool, catching the morning light. You hadn't summoned it. A servant had placed it there, perhaps by custom, or perhaps by quiet suggestion. It showed your face, unadorned, the same face that had now appeared in dozens of drawings, on market walls, in children's chalk, even on fabric dyed in indigo and ochre, not in tribute, but in mimicry. Your image had ceased being yours. It had become theirs, and it carried weight now, not of gold or fear, but of expectation. You touched your brow. No crown, only sweat. Behind you, Tienne entered. She carried a scroll and a silence, thicker than usual. "You've been sent another message," she said. You turned. Her hands trembled slightly as she unrolled the parchment. The seal was different this time. No sigil, no color, just a fingerprint in dried blood. The message, though, brief, cut deeper than any decree. The man who refuses the gods becomes a god to those who forget what gods can do. Beneath it, the symbol of the moon eaters. You looked up. Tienne swallowed hard. They've written only twice in the last decade. Once before a temple was burned in Elephantine. Once before a vizier was found poisoned. You nodded slowly. They believe silence is their right, but we've stolen it. Tienne added. Or we've spoken too loudly. You closed the scroll and let its weight press inward. The Moon Eaters were a sect unrecognized, unnamed in court. They did not seek thrones or temples. They sought to erase memory. Wherever belief grew old or complex or forgiving, they came like moths to the flame of nuance. And now you had kindled a fire. That afternoon, you sat in the archive courtyard, the same stone garden where you had first invited the people to speak freely. This time, it was not the people who came. It was the past. A group of elders, former scribes, widows of soldiers, a priest who had stepped down before your father's reign. They carried no petitions, only questions. Do you believe the gods are gone? One asked. You answered carefully, I believe they are listening differently. Do you still pray? Asked another. Yes, you said. But now I wait longer for the reply. A murmur passed, not approval, not disapproval, only human recognition. And then the priest spoke. He was thin, his voice the rustle of old cloth. Your father, he said, once fasted for 9 days before speaking in this square. The people feared him, but they believed the gods feared him too. You met the man's gaze. And what do they say of me? He didn't smile, but neither did he frown. They say you kneel where he would not. You nodded. Then let my knees be remembered. That night, you stood on the terrace, the wind sweeping across the palace roof. Nazala joined you, her shawl drawn close, her hair pinned with copper. They threaten now, she said. Yes, they will act. Perhaps. She looked out at the horizon, where the stone wall of Seta Meket now glowed faintly in torchlight. You cannot unbuild what you've made. I know. She touched your hand. Then build further. You turned to her. What do you mean? Don't just carve the people. Let them carve themselves. You thought on this long into the night, and by morning, you summoned your artisans. You led them not to the stone, but to the open square. You gave them chalk, charcoal, pigment, and told them nothing more than this: show me what tomorrow looks unlike. They hesitated. Then, slowly, they began. Children painted trees bearing books instead of fruit. Old women drew hands, passing water jugs across city walls. One young girl, perhaps no older than 10, etched a drawing of a kneeling king, his hand open, with dozens of birds flying from it. And above him, a sun, but not the eye of Ra, a full circle, blank, waiting to be filled. You knelt beside her. "What is that?" you asked. She grinned. "It's whatever you want it to be." You laughed softly and realized you had created something dangerous. Not rebellion, not idolatry, but imagination. The next scroll arrived in the afternoon. Short, brutal. Imagination is the first betrayal. Tien read it, then looked up. "They're watching," you answered quietly. "Then let them see everything." That evening, you addressed your court, but not with fear, with invitation. "We are watched," you said, "by those who remember too tightly. By those who wish to close the eye we've dared to open. So I ask you this, not to protect me, but to protect the question we've carved into stone. What if the throne belongs to all of us?" Some lowered their heads. Others wept. None objected. The 17th hour of your reign ended not in secrecy, nor in confrontation, but in open sky, and a king staring into his own reflection, not to admire, but to remember who was looking back. The 18th hour of your reign did not begin with banners, nor did it begin with warning drums or the call of conchis. It began with a breeze, cooler than usual, threaded with dust and the faint smell of old leather and river salt. You stood at the edge of the royal portico facing north. The wind carried silence, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that comes when someone holds their breath, just before a blade is drawn. Nasala joined you there, her robe drawn tight, her gaze already reaching the horizon. "They stir," she said. You nodded, still listening to the wind. Like a lion stretches before the hunt. Later that morning, Tien entered the council chamber with her steps sharper than usual. She carried no scroll, only a stone tablet, smooth and warm from her satchel. "A message," she said, placing it before you. The tablet bore only 6 symbols, etched not with ceremony, but with intent. A northern wind spiral, a cluster of spears, and the sigil of Memphis, broken in 2. You inhaled deeply. "They gather beyond the 5th cataract," she said. "No standard, no divine symbols, just formation." "And who leads?" Nasala asked. Tien hesitated. "We suspect a Menakte." A murmur passed through the room like the tail of a serpent in sand. The name was old, older than your reign, older than your temple walk. Amenakt had once been commander of the river legions, a man made of iron and silence. He had been exiled under your grandfather's reign for defying the royal temple edicts, choosing grain shipments over divine tribute. Now it seemed he had chosen to return. You dismissed the council for the afternoon, but you did not rest. Instead, you walked through the square, through the granaries, through the quarter where sandals were mended and the walls were chalked with children's dreams. You listened, and what you heard was not fear. It was something more dangerous. Confusion. He was a good soldier, they say. He brought water to the lower wells when the priests still debated omens. He never bowed. These were the whispers, and you knew what they meant. They remembered him, not for rebellion, but for usefulness. That night, in the stone garden, you met with Ahamun, the potter whose fingers still bore the clay of 1,000 vessels. He was never hungry for thrones, Ahamun said, but he knew how to move people. Why return now? you asked. Because stillness makes men believe the world is waiting for them. You sat with those words long after Ahamun had gone. And before the first bird cried to the moon, you wrote a message of your own. It was not long. It was not loud. Just 12 words, etched into a tablet of red ochre. Let the wind speak. We will not answer with fire. You sent it north, via the same underground channels used in years of drought, when food moved faster through silence than decree. Whether it reached him, you did not know. But you had sent it. You had spoken. That act alone mattered. By morning, the northern winds had grown colder, not in temperature, but in tone. A second message arrived, not in clay, not in ink, but sewn into the lining of a merchant's cloak. A scrap of hide, burned along the edge, written in oil. We do not need gods. We do not need kings. We remember how to stand. No signature, only the sign of two crossed bones. Tien read it beside you, then asked quietly, "Will you call the guard?" You shook your head. "No, we call the farmers." She blinked. "The farmers?" "Yes," you said. "We plant our response." And so, you ordered it. Not troops, not towers. Seeds, thousands of them, sent northward with no banners, no fanfare. Millet, barley, lentils, packed in sacks labeled with a single mark, an open hand. And you sent masons with them, not to build walls, but wells. When the people saw it, they would understand. You would not rule through fear. You would water the land before it cracked. Nasala questioned you gently that evening. What if they strike anyway? You replied, then they strike soil that remembers being fed. That night, alone in your chamber, you lit a single lamp. You placed the tablet with your 12 words beside it. And then, for the first time in many nights, you slept. Not as a man preparing for war, but as a king whose hands had sown something no sword could reap. The wind still came from the north, but now it carried the smell of soil, of decisions, and the faintest trace of wild lentil bloom. The 18th hour of your reign ended not with steel, not with speech, but with silence that held its ground and waited to be understood. The 19th hour of your reign began not with a messenger, nor with the rattle of weapons. It began with a ripple, soft, deliberate, through the silence of a city listening to the north. The tent appeared at first as a pale dot on the flat red plain. By the 3rd hour of daylight, it had grown in shape and intention. Not grand, not fortified, but unmistakably positioned. A single cloth structure, pinned by weighted stone, facing southward as if in expectation. You stood upon the high terrace, gazing toward it. Nasala joined you, her shawl wrapped loosely around her arms. "It does not pretend to be a camp," she said. "No," you replied. "It pretends to be an idea." By midday, Tieni arrived with news. A trader from Lower Nubia had brought with him a message, not inked, not chiseled, but embroidered into the hem of his travel robe. 3 words in red thread. Come. No weapons. No threat. No demand. Just an invitation shaped by centuries of caution. Amenhotep had returned, and he had chosen not to strike, but to speak. The council, when summoned, was divided. Some urged a show of strength, troops on the border, emissaries with sharp tongues. Others feared a trap, cloaked in etiquette. You listened to them all, then dismissed the room, and prepared to go alone. Nasala followed you to the edge of the city. "If you go, go not as Pharaoh," she said. "But what else am I?" She touched your hand gently. "A man who listens. That is rarer than a king." You wore no robe of gold, only linen dyed in soft umber. Around your neck, a single amulet, a carved ear, gifted by a street child months before. You brought no guard, only silence. And the pouch of spiced tea leaves your mother had once kept hidden for the most sacred guests. The walk was long, not in distance, but in memory. For with each step, you pass through echoes, not of battles, but of debates, of times when kings had met at borders and left either wiser or broken. The tent was still. Windless, a single flap drawn aside, and within, Amenakti. He rose as you entered. His beard was longer, streaked with silver, his face deeply lined, but not with bitterness, only long use. He bowed slightly. You returned the gesture. He motioned to the ground between you. 2 mats, 1 kettle. You sat. He poured. It was not wine, nor barley water. It was tea. Dark, scented with thyme and something unnameable. You came, he said. You asked. He nodded. The silence between you stretched, not uncomfortably, like a bridge still under construction. I did not bring war, he said at last, and I did not bring armies. Then we are both men of restraint, or memory, you added. He smiled faintly. I remember the famine of year 10. I remember how you rerouted the grain caravans, long before the priests gave permission, and they exiled me for it. You nodded. I never agreed with their judgment. That, he said, is why I asked for you, and not your title. Another silence. He placed something before you, a slab of sandstone, palm-sized, etched. Upon it, a single image, a balance scale, both sides even, but no weights upon them. A question, he said, not a verdict. You understood. What is it you ask? He answered plainly. That your wall be carved with more than southern names, that our language be etched beside yours, that the children of the north grow up seeing themselves not as ruled, but as rooted. You took the stone in hand. It was heavier than it looked. I can do that, you said. He tilted his head. Without being told, without being threatened. He let out a long breath and refilled the tea. As you drank, he added softly, They expect me to fail, you know. The others. They want me to return in disgrace. Do you fear that? I fear forgetting what I stood for more. You nodded. Then placed something on the mat between you. A seed, small, ridged, dark. Amenakti examined it. A fenugreek seed, he said. No, you replied. A promise that what we plant now, others will taste later. The tea cooled, the light shifted, and the air in the tent no longer felt like silence. It felt like space. When you rose to leave, he offered you one last thing, a thin ribbon of cloth, faded blue. The sash of my command, he said. It no longer belongs on my arm. You hesitated, then accepted it. Not as surrender, as signal. When you returned to Napata, the people asked no questions. They saw the cloth in your hands, and they knew a line had not been drawn. It had been walked. Yes. 19th hour of your reign ended not in ink, not in fire, but in tea poured by an enemy, and a stone placed on the scale of history, not to tip it, but to steady it. The final hour of your reign, 20th and last, did not arrive with thunder. It did not come cloaked in prophecy or framed in fire. It arrived with breath. Yours. Steady, shallow, filled with memory. You awoke before the sky had begun to change, before the birds began their chatter in the high garden, before the first baker stirred his embers to life. It was the hour of the quietest drum, a heart beating not for battle, not for law, but for parting. You rose slowly, unaided, though your limbs now bore the weight of years not just lived, but witnessed. Each step from the sleeping chamber to the terrace was a farewell, not only to stone and chamber, but to self. Outside, the stars still clung gently to the sky. Orion lingered over the east, his belt faint, like a thread unraveling. You looked toward the distant field. There, in that soil, beneath young sprigs of barley, lay the urn you had buried with your own hands. Within it, 2 seeds. One from Amenakti, one from you. Neither yet sprouted, but already their presence had changed the land. Already, People walked differently past the field. Not quickly, but with pause. Already, children had begun to leave little offerings near the mound. Feathers, bits of string, fragments of verse. It had become, without altar, a holy place. You broke your fast in silence. Tiene entered shortly after, carrying a fresh scroll. But you raised your hand gently. No records today, you said. Let the last story remain unwritten. She bowed and left. By mid-morning, the court had gathered. They stood, not in columns, not in order, but in a wide circle beneath the eastern portico. No throne was placed, no titles were recited, only quiet. You stepped into the center. You wore no crown, only linen. Pale, clean, soft against your skin like woven memory. Nasala stepped forward. She held the sash once given by Amenakta, faded blue, its frayed edges now folded into a perfect braid. She placed it in your hands, then returned to the circle. You turned once, slowly, meeting the eyes of all those who had shaped your reign, and you spoke. I did not rule alone. The wind shifted, not a gust, a breath. You continued. I was carried. By words, by silences, by those who dared to walk beside me instead of behind. And now I leave this circle as I entered it, barefoot, so the soil remembers me. A small boy stepped forward, clutching a clay tablet. He held it up, on it, a carving, a figure planting seeds with one hand and reaching out with the other. You took it, kissed the edge, then passed it to the wall masons. Let this be the last shape. The masons nodded and set off towards Seta Meket. You turned back to the court. Today, I do not die. A murmur. You smiled. I become many. And then you walked. Down the steps, through the gate, past the well, to the eastern field. There, you knelt before the soil, pressed your palms to the ground, and whispered your name, not for the people, for the earth. A quiet offering. Soft planting, behind you, no applause, no eulogy, only presence. As the sun reached its peak, you lay beneath the fig tree nearest the field. The same fig tree that once shaded your mother's weaving mat. The same tree that dropped its first ripe fruit during your 7th summer. Nasala sat beside you. Tiene knelt at your feet. A breeze stirred. You exhaled once, deep, and closed your eyes, not in weakness, in release. The wind carried your breath across the field, over the market, through the stone garden, and onto the steps of the great archive. And still, you did not rise. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of sweet wine. Children sang quietly near the palace gates. A single flame was lit near the wall. A flame not for mourning, but for remembering. In the days that followed, they did not crown another at once. They let the field grow. They let the wall breathe. And slowly, gently, your story began to scatter, not in scrolls, but in songs. They called you not Pharaoh, not High Son of Amun. They called you the one who waited. And in the northern hills, where once swords were sharpened, mothers now taught the children of how a king once sat in a silent tent and drank tea with the man meant to destroy him. In the southern ports, sailors scratched your symbol onto their oars, a hand open, fingers spread, facing upward. And in Napata, the people passed down the tale of how you planted your legacy, not in tombs, not in gold, but in soil, and the seeds bloomed, not always quickly, not always evenly, but certainly. The final hour of your reign did not end at all. It continued, every time someone walked barefoot across the dust and said, I remember when we listened.